No one spoke to the village blacksmith. Until he freed a chained child, the morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding Cedar Falls like a shroud, and Thomas Brennan could feel the weight of another day pressing down on his shoulders before he even opened his eyes. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the distant promise of snow. He rolled out of his narrow bed, his joints protesting from years of working the forge, and pulled on his worn flannel shirt. At 52, Thomas had grown accustomed to the silence, not the comfortable quiet of a peaceful morning, but the deliberate, pointed silence of a community that had decided he no longer existed. His heavy boots echoed on the wooden floor of his small cabin as he made his way to the kitchen, where yesterday's coffee sat cold and bitter in the pot. Through the window, he could see the main street of Cedar Falls beginning to stir. Mrs. Henderson swept her porch with the same methodical strokes she'd used for the past decade, while old Pete Johnson walked his ancient retriever down the sidewalk. Neither would acknowledge Thomas if he stepped outside. Neither had spoken to him in 3 years. The forge behind his cabin stood like a monument to better times. Built by his father 40 years ago, it had once been the heart of the community. Farmers brought their tools for repair, horses needed shoeing, and the sound of hammer on anvil had been as much a part of Cedar Falls as the church bell on Sunday mornings. Now, dust gathered on the bellows, and weeds grew through the cracks in the stone foundation. Thomas poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee and sat at his kitchen table, staring at the unopened letter that had arrived yesterday. The return address read Cedar Falls Municipal Court, and he knew what it contained without opening it. Another notice about unpaid property taxes. Another reminder that the town council wanted him gone. The irony wasn't lost on him. They wanted him to leave, but they also refused to let him sell. No one in Cedar Falls would buy property from him, and word had spread to neighboring towns. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, paying the price for one terrible night 3 years ago. The memory came flooding back, as it did every morning. The Johnson boy, 17 years old, full of promise, heading to college in the fall. The rain had been coming down in sheets, and Thomas had been driving home from Miller's Bar, where he'd spent the evening drowning his sorrows after losing his wife to cancer. Just 6 months before, he'd only had 3 beers, but the grief had made him careless, made him think he could handle the winding mountain road in conditions that would challenge a sober man. The boy had been walking along the shoulder, no reflective clothing, no flashlight. Thomas never saw him until it was too late. The impact had been sickening, a dull thud that would echo in his nightmares. For the rest of his life, when he'd pulled over, shaking, the boy was already gone, dead on impact. The coroner would later confirm. Thomas had called 911 immediately, had stayed at the scene, had cooperated fully with the investigation. His blood alcohol had been just under the legal limit, and the accident had been ruled a tragedy. Wet roads, poor visibility, a pedestrian wearing dark clothing. No charges were filed, but in the court of public opinion, Thomas Brennan had been found guilty of murder. The boy's parents, the Johnsons, had moved away within a month. They couldn't bear to stay in a town where their son's killer walked free. The rest of Cedar Falls had made their feelings clear through a campaign of silence that was more devastating than any shouting match or angry confrontation. Orders for the forge dried up overnight. The grocery store clerk would ring up his purchases. Without a word of greeting, the postman left mail on his doorstep without knocking. Thomas had tried to reach out, to apologize, to make amends somehow. He'd written letters to the Johnsons that went unanswered. He'd attempted to volunteer at the local food bank, only to be told his services weren't needed. He'd even tried to attend the weekly grief support group at the Methodist church, but the other members had simply stared at him in uncomfortable silence until he'd left. Now, as he sat in his kitchen watching the town wake up without him, Thomas wondered if this was how it would end. Would he simply fade away, becoming a ghost, haunting the edges of a community that had already erased him from their collective memory? The sound of a car engine breaking down interrupted his dark thoughts. Through the window, he could see a battered Ford sedan pulled over on the side of the road, steam rising from under the hood. A woman stood beside it, her shoulders sagging, with defeat while a small child, A boy, maybe 8 or 9, sat on the car's bumper. Swinging his legs, Thomas knew he should stay inside. Any attempt to help would likely be rebuffed, and he couldn't bear another rejection. But something about the woman's posture, the way she kept looking up and down the empty road as if hoping for rescue, stirred something in him. His father had taught him that a man's worth was measured by his willingness to help others, regardless of the consequences to himself. He pulled on his heavy work jacket and stepped outside. The morning air was sharp against his face as he walked toward the stranded vehicle. The woman looked up as he approached, and he could see the wariness in her eyes. She was young, maybe 30, with prematurely gray streaks in her dark hair and the kind of tired lines around her eyes. That came from too much worry and too little sleep. "Trouble with your car?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. The woman glanced around nervously, as if looking for other options. "It just started overheating," she said finally. "I don't know much about cars. I might be able to take a look." Thomas offered, "I'm pretty handy with engines." The boy on the bumper looked up at him with curious eyes. There was something unsettling about the child's gaze, an adult wariness that didn't belong on such a young face. The boy's clothes were clean but worn, and Thomas noticed the way he kept glancing back at the woman, as if seeking permission for every small movement. Thomas," he said, extending his hand to the woman. She hesitated before shaking it briefly. "Sarah, this is my son, Danny." The boy didn't respond to his name, just continued staring at Thomas with those unnaturally alert eyes. Something about the child's behavior nagged at Thomas, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "Let me pop the hood and take a look," Thomas said, already moving toward the front of the car. The problem was immediately apparent. A burst radiator hose had dumped all the coolant onto the road. It was a simple fix, but not something that could be done roadside without parts and tools. "Your radiator hose is shot," Thomas explained. "I've got a spare in my workshop that might fit, and I can have you back on the road in about an hour." Sarah's face showed a mixture of relief and concern. I don't have much money for repairs." "No charge," Thomas said quickly, "just glad to help." Something flickered across Sarah's face, surprise, maybe, or suspicion. In Thomas's experience, people who had been hurt often had trouble accepting kindness, always looking for the catch. "That's very kind of you," she said slowly, "but I wouldn't want to impose, no imposition at all." Thomas assured her, "Tell you what, why don't you and Danny come up to the house while I work on the car? I've got coffee, and I think there might be some cookies in the pantry." Again, that quick glance between Sarah and the boy. Danny had gone completely still, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That's okay," Sarah said quickly. "We wait here." Thomas nodded, sensing the refusal came from fear rather than politeness. "I'll bring the tools down here then. Won't take long." As he walked back toward his cabin, Thomas could feel their eyes on him. There was something wrong with this picture. A woman and child broken down on a lonely road, skittish as wild animals. The boy's strange silence, but it wasn't his place to pry. He'd learned the hard way that good intentions could sometimes cause more harm than help. In his workshop, Thomas gathered the tools he'd need and found a radiator hose that looked like it would fit. As he worked, he found himself glancing toward the road where Sarah and Danny waited. The woman kept checking her watch and looking back the way they'd come, as if expecting someone to follow them. It was none of his business. Thomas told himself he was just fixing a car for a stranger, nothing more. But as he knelt beside the Ford and began the repair, he couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter was about to change everything. The mountains around Cedar Falls stood silent and watchful, their autumn colors muted by the gray morning sky. In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the valley, carrying with it the promise of destinations unknown and perhaps, for some, the hope of escape. The radiator hose replacement took longer than Thomas had expected. The old hose had been secured with a clamp that had rusted solid, and he'd had to use penetrating oil and patience to work it free. Throughout the repair, he was aware of Sarah and Danny watching him from a distance, their nervous energy almost palpable in the crisp morning air. "Almost done," Thomas called out. Wiping his hands on a rag, Just need to top off the coolant and let it warm up. Sarah nodded, but she kept glancing at the digital watch on her wrist. Thomas noticed it was an expensive piece, incongruous with her worn clothing and the beat-up car. The boy, Danny, had barely moved from his spot on the bumper, maintaining the same unnatural stillness that had unsettled Thomas from the beginning. As Thomas added coolant to the radiator, he tried to make conversation. "Y'all traveling far?" "Just passing through," Sarah answered quickly. Too quickly. "Beautiful country up here." Thomas continued, keeping his tone casual. "Especially this time of year. You picked a good time to visit." Danny suddenly spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're not visiting." Sarah's face went pale, and she shot the boy a sharp look. "Danny, why don't you get in the car?" The child immediately complied, sliding off the bumper and climbing into the passenger seat without another word. Thomas noticed how quickly he obeyed, how his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. The observation sent a chill down Thomas's spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Family business," Sarah said by way of explanation, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Thomas nodded and closed the hood. "Should be good to go. I'd recommend getting that looked at properly when you reach wherever you're headed. This is just a temporary fix." "Thank you," Sarah said, reaching into her purse. "I insist on paying you something." "No need," Thomas replied, already backing away from the car. "Safe travels." Sarah hesitated for a moment, studying his face as if trying to read something there. Finally, she got into the car and started the engine. The Ford rumbled to life, running smoothly now that the cooling system was functioning properly. As they pulled away, Thomas caught sight of Danny's face in the side mirror. The boy was looking back at him, and for just a moment, their eyes met. There was something in that gaze, a plea, maybe, or a warning. Then the car disappeared around a bend in the road, leaving Thomas standing alone on the shoulder. The encounter stayed with him as he walked back to his cabin. Something about the woman and child didn't sit right, but he couldn't identify exactly what it was. The boy's behavior had been odd, certainly, but maybe he was just shy. Some kids were like that around strangers. Thomas spent the rest of the morning trying to distract himself with chores around the property. He cleaned his tools, organized his workshop, and even attempted to read a book he'd started weeks ago. But his mind kept returning to the image of Danny's face in the mirror, to the fear he'd seen in those young eyes. By afternoon, the encounter had taken on an almost dreamlike quality. Maybe he'd imagined the undercurrents of tension, the sense that something was wrong. 3 years of isolation had made him hypersensitive to human interaction, perhaps causing him to read too much into a simple roadside assistance. He was chopping firewood behind his cabin when he heard the car returning. The sound of the engine was unmistakable, the same slightly rough idle he'd noticed while making the repair. Thomas set down his axe and walked toward the front of his property. Wondering if the temporary fix had failed, the Ford was pulled over in the same spot as before. But this time the hood wasn't up. Sarah sat behind the wheel, and Thomas could see her shoulders shaking. She was crying. Thomas approached slowly, giving her time to notice him. When she looked up, her face was streaked with tears, and there was a desperation in her eyes that made his chest tighten. "Car trouble again?" he asked gently. Sarah shook her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go." Thomas looked toward the passenger seat, expecting to see Danny, but the boy wasn't there. "Where's your son?" "He's not my son," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "His name is Danny Martinez, and I think I just saved his life." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He looked around frantically, scanning the area for any sign of the boy. "Where is he hidden?" Sarah said. "Safe, for now, but I don't know what to do next." Thomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "I think you'd better start from the beginning." Sarah took a shuddering breath. "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a social worker with the state of Colorado. 3 days ago, I was assigned to do a welfare check on a family in Millfield. That's about 60 miles east of here. The Hendersons had been reported for possible child abuse." Thomas's blood ran cold. Danny Martinez," Sarah confirmed. "He's been in the system for 2 years." bounced between foster homes. The Hendersons were supposed to be his last chance before aging out at 18. But when I got there, she trailed off, her face crumpling. What did you find? He was chained to a radiator in the basement, Sarah whispered. Actually chained, with a padlock. He was malnourished, terrified, and covered in bruises. The Hendersons claimed he was violent, that they had to restrain him for everyone's safety. Thomas felt sick. Did you call the police? Of course I did. But the Hendersons have friends in the department. The sheriff himself came out, took one look at Danny, and said the boy was clearly disturbed. He suggested I recommend residential treatment, basically a juvenile detention facility. But that's not what happened. Sarah shook her head. I couldn't do it. I couldn't send that child to another place where he'd be locked up and forgotten. So I made a decision that probably ended my career. I took him. You kidnapped him. I saved him. Sarah said fiercely, there's a difference. I've been trying to get him to my sister in Seattle. She's a therapist, and she's agreed to take him in while I figure out how to make this legal. Thomas rubbed his face, trying to process what he was hearing. Why are you telling me this? Because I think they're following us, Sarah said. I've seen the same pickup truck in my mirrors for the last 50 miles. And because, she looked at him with desperate hope, because you helped us this morning without asking questions or wanting anything in return. In my line of work, you learned to recognize the good ones. The irony of being called one of the good ones by someone who didn't know his history wasn't lost on Thomas, but there was something in Sarah's voice, a conviction that reminded him of his late wife Emma when she'd get passionate about a cause. Where's Danny now? Thomas asked. There's an old logging road about half a mile back. He's hiding in the trees with our supplies. I told him if I didn't come back within an hour, he should find a way to call 911. Thomas looked at his watch. How long has it been? 45 minutes. Show me. Sarah blinked in surprise. You'll help. I'll listen, Thomas corrected. That's all I'm promising right now. They took Thomas's pickup truck, leaving Sarah's car where it was in case whoever was following them came looking. The logging road was barely visible from the main highway, just dirt tracks disappearing into the pine forest. Thomas had hunted these woods as a boy and knew them well. They found Danny exactly where Sarah had said he would be, sitting with his back against a massive pine tree, a small backpack clutched to his chest when he saw Thomas. The boy's eyes went wide with fear. It's okay, Sarah said quickly. Thomas is going to help us. Danny looked between them, his face unreadable. Are you going to turn us in? Thomas crouched down to the boy's level, noting the way Danny flinched when he moved. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. That's a promise, for the first time since Thomas had met him. Danny's rigid posture relaxed slightly. The man with the chains said promises don't mean anything. Well, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest, that man was wrong. Some promises are worth everything. In the distance, they heard the sound of a vehicle on the main road, moving slowly as if the driver was searching for something. All three of them went still, listening to the engine grow louder, then fade as it continued down the highway. We need to move, Sarah said. If they're checking every side road, they won't find us, Thomas said, standing. I know a place. As they gathered their few belongings, Thomas found himself making a decision that would change everything. 3 years ago, his failure to act responsibly had cost a young man his life. Today, he had a chance to save a child's life instead. The weight of that opportunity felt heavier than any hammer he'd ever swung, and far more important than any forge he'd ever tended. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas Brennan had a purpose that mattered more than his own pain. The safe house Thomas had in mind was a hunting cabin deep in the national forest, accessible only by a network of old logging roads that most people had forgotten existed. His grandfather had built it in the 1940s, and Thomas had maintained it over the years as a retreat from the world. Now, it would serve as a sanctuary for a boy who had already seen too much of the world's cruelty. The cabin was rustic but solid, one room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a sleeping loft accessible by a wooden ladder. Solar panels on the roof provided enough electricity for basic needs and a hand-pumped well supplied. Fresh water. It was the kind of place where a person could disappear for days or weeks without anyone knowing. Danny had remained silent during the drive, pressed against the passenger door of Thomas's truck as if ready to bolt at any moment. Sarah sat between them, her hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. The physical contact seemed to calm him, and Thomas noticed how the child's rigid posture gradually relaxed under her touch. "This is perfect," Sarah said as they pulled up to the cabin. "How long can we stay?" "As long as you need," Thomas replied, though he knew it wasn't that simple. "But we need to talk about what comes next inside the cabin." Thomas got a fire going while Sarah helped Danny settle in. The boy's few possessions fit in a single backpack: a worn teddy bear, a handful of books, and a sketchpad filled with surprisingly sophisticated drawings. Thomas noticed that most of the sketches were of windows, doors, and what looked like escape routes. "You're a good artist," Thomas said, sitting down beside Danny on the old couch. The boy looked up at him with cautious eyes. "Art teacher at school said I had natural talent." He spoke the phrase as if quoting someone, his voice carrying a hint of pride quickly suppressed. "What's your favorite thing to draw?" Danny considered the question seriously. "Birds," he said finally. "They can fly away whenever they want." The simple statement hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. He had to clear his throat before speaking again. "Maybe you could draw some of the birds around here. There are hawks, eagles, even some owls if you know where to look." For the first time, Danny's face showed genuine interest. Really. I'll show you the best spots tomorrow morning." Sarah, who had been quietly preparing a simple meal from their supplies, looked over at Thomas with gratitude. "Danny loves wildlife," she said. "He's got an amazing memory for details." "The chains had scratches," Danny said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. 17 scratches on the left side, 23 on the right. I counted them every day." The silence that followed was heavy with shared pain. Thomas felt his hands clench into fists, and he had to consciously relax them. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly. "You won't have to count scratches anymore," Thomas said quietly. "I promise." Danny looked at him with the intensity of a child who had learned not to trust adult promises. "How do you know?" "Because," Thomas said, meeting the boy's gaze, "some people spend their whole lives trying to make up for one bad thing they did, and saving you. That might be the most important thing I ever do." Later that evening, after Danny had fallen asleep in the loft, Thomas and Sarah sat by the fire discussing their options. The situation was more complicated than either of them had initially realized. "I've been thinking about this all day," Sarah said, staring into the flames. "Even if we get Danny to Seattle, they'll track us down eventually. I've violated about a dozen laws, and the Hendersons will claim I kidnapped him. What about the evidence, the chains, the bruises?" A good lawyer could argue that the restraints were necessary for a dangerous child, and bruises heal. Without ongoing documentation, it becomes my word against theirs. Sarah's voice was bitter with frustration. "The system is designed to protect itself, not the kids." Thomas poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks up the chimney. "What if there was another way?" "What do you mean?" "What if Danny just disappeared from the system? What if he became someone else?" Sarah stared at him. "You're talking about creating a false identity for a child. That's not just illegal, it's what he needs." Thomas interrupted. "Look, I know what it's like to be judged for something that wasn't entirely your fault. This boy has been failed by every adult who was supposed to protect him. Maybe it's time for some adults to actually put his needs first. And you think you can do that? Create a new identity?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I know some people from before. People who help others start over when the system fails them." "What people?" "Veterans mostly. Guys who came back from overseas and couldn't get the help they needed. They've got networks, resources. They know how to make someone invisible when they need to be." Sarah studied his face in the firelight. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious. Danny deserves a chance at a normal life, and he's not going to get it if he stays in the system." "What about me? I can't just disappear. I have a job, a life. You said yourself that your career is probably over." The state isn't going to just forget that you took a child without authorization. Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. Finally, she spoke. If we did this, and I'm not saying we should, what would it look like? New names, new histories. I've got money saved up, enough to get you both settled somewhere far from here. You could start over, maybe continue your work with children, in a different state. And you, what would you get out of all this? Thomas considered the question. Peace, maybe a chance to do something right for once. Before Sarah could respond, they heard a vehicle approaching on the logging road. Both of them went rigid, listening to the sound of tires on gravel growing closer. Thomas quickly doused the fire and moved to the window, peering through the curtains. A pickup truck was pulling up to the cabin, its headlights cutting through the darkness. As Thomas watched, two men got out, one he didn't recognize, and another who made his blood run cold. It's Sheriff Davis, he whispered to Sarah. From Millfield. Sarah's face went pale. How did they find us? I don't know, but we need to get Danny out of here. Now, they heard footsteps on the cabin's front porch, followed by a heavy knock on the door. Thomas Brennan, a voice called out. This is Sheriff Davis. We need to talk. Thomas motioned for Sarah to stay quiet and climbed the ladder to the loft. Danny was already awake, his eyes wide with terror. Is it him? The boy whispered. Is it Mr. Henderson? No, Thomas said softly. But we need to go right now. The cabin had a back door that led to a narrow trail through the woods. Thomas had used it for hunting expeditions and knew it would take them to another logging road about a mile away. It was their only chance. Open up, Brennan. The sheriff's voice was more insistent now. We know you're in there. Thomas helped Danny down from the loft, and the three of them moved quickly toward the back door. Sarah grabbed their backpack while Thomas snatched a flashlight and his car keys. They slipped out into the cold night air just as the sheriff began pounding on the front door. The trail was narrow and rocky, treacherous in the darkness, but Thomas knew it by heart. Behind them, they could hear the men breaking down the cabin door. This way, Thomas whispered, leading them deeper into the forest. Stay close and keep quiet. As they moved through the trees, Thomas's mind raced with questions. How had the sheriff found them so quickly? Who had tipped him off? And most importantly, what would happen to Danny if they were caught? The boy was struggling to keep up, his shorter legs no match for the rough terrain. Thomas slowed his pace, but he could hear voices behind them now, and the beam of flashlights sweeping through the trees. I can't, Danny gasped, stumbling on a root. I can't run anymore. Thomas didn't hesitate. He swept the boy up in his arms, ignoring the protest from his aging back. I've got you, he said. I'm not letting go. Behind them, the voices were getting closer. The hunt was on, and Thomas knew that everything, Danny's future, Sarah's freedom, and his own chance at redemption, depended on reaching the other side of the mountain before dawn. The forest closed around them like a protective embrace, and Thomas found himself praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years, not for himself, but for the child in his arms, who had already suffered more than any human being should endure. The emergency logging road was farther than Thomas had remembered and steeper. Each step up the mountain trail felt like a small victory against the voices and flashlight beams that seemed to be gaining ground behind them. Danny had stopped protesting about being carried and instead clung to Thomas's neck, his small body trembling from cold and fear. How much farther? Sarah whispered, her breath coming in short puffs in the thin mountain air. Almost there, Thomas replied, though he wasn't entirely sure. The old trails had changed over the years, and some of the landmarks he remembered from his youth had been obscured by fallen trees and new growth. They pushed through a thicket of pine branches, and suddenly the trees opened up to reveal a dirt road carved into the mountainside. Thomas set Danny down gently, his arms aching from the climb. Where does this go? Sarah asked, looking up and down the empty road. Down to Highway 87, Thomas said, pulling out his phone to check for a signal. About 3 miles. Do we walk? Thomas shook his head. Too risky. They'll have cars on the highways by now. He looked at Danny, who was sitting on a fallen log, his face pale and exhausted. But I know someone who might help. The phone call was brief and cryptic. Thomas simply said, "It's Tom Brennan. I need that favor you offered 3 years ago." The voice on the other end, gravelly and tired, asked only where and when. 20 minutes later, they heard the rumble of a diesel engine approaching from the direction of the highway. The vehicle that emerged from the darkness was a converted school bus, painted forest green and equipped with enough solar panels and antennas to run a small communication center. The man who stepped out of the bus was everything Thomas remembered. Tall, lean, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. Marcus Webb had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to find that his country had little use for his particular set of skills. He'd built a new life helping people who needed to disappear, for reasons both legal and otherwise. "Tom," Marcus said, extending his hand. "It's been too long, Marcus. Thanks for coming." Marcus's gaze moved to Sarah and Danny, taking in their appearance with the practiced eye of someone who had seen countless refugees. "What's the situation?" Thomas quickly explained about Danny's circumstances, about Sarah's decision to remove him from an abusive situation, and about the sheriff who was now hunting them through the forest. "The boy's been through hell," Thomas concluded. "He needs a chance at a normal life, and he's not going to get it if he goes back into the system." Marcus nodded slowly. What are you asking me to do?" "What you do best, make them disappear, both of them." Thomas looked at Sarah, who had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement. "If she wants to, Sarah started, then stopped. She looked down at Danny, who was watching the adults with the careful attention of a child whose survival had always depended on reading the moods of the people around him. "I can't abandon him, not after everything he's been through. Then we do this together," Marcus said. "But you need to understand what you're asking. New identities, new histories, new lives. There's no going back from this. There's no going back anyway," Sarah said quietly. "I made my choice when I took him out of that basement." Marcus opened the bus door. "Get in. We'll talk more once we're clear of the area." As they climbed aboard, Thomas was amazed by the bus's interior. What had once been rows of school seats had been converted into a mobile command center, complete with computers, communications equipment, and sleeping quarters. It was like something out of a spy movie. "This is incredible," Sarah said, looking around in wonder. "Home sweet home," Marcus replied, starting the engine. "Tom, you coming with us?" Thomas hesitated. He'd been so focused on getting Danny to safety that he hadn't thought about what would happen to his own life. "I don't know. I've got responsibilities here." "What responsibilities?" Marcus asked bluntly. "A town that won't speak to you, a forge that hasn't been used in years, a life you're just marking time in." The words stung because they were true. Thomas looked at Danny, who was curled up in one of the bus's converted seating areas, finally allowing himself to rest. The boy's face was peaceful in sleep, free from the hypervigilance that had marked his every waking moment. "He's going to need stability," Thomas said. "People he can trust. He trusts you." Sarah observed, "I've never seen him relax around an adult the way he does with you." Marcus put the bus in gear, and they began the slow descent toward the highway. "I've got a place in mind," he said. "Small town in Oregon, near the coast, good schools, friendly people, and no one asks too many questions about newcomers." "What about documentation?" "Social security numbers, school records, leave that to me. I've got contacts who can create bulletproof identities." "The boy will have a complete history, birth certificate, medical records, everything he needs to start over." Thomas felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the weight of a life-changing decision. "What about the sheriff? What happens when he can't find us?" "He'll keep looking for a while," Marcus said. "But eventually, the trail will go cold. People disappear all the time, especially in cases like this where the legal situation is murky. And if he doesn't give up, then we'll deal with that when it happens." As they reached the highway, Thomas looked back toward the mountains where they'd left behind the only life he'd known for 52 years. Somewhere in those forests, Sheriff Davis was still searching for them, probably calling in reinforcements and setting up roadblocks. But they were already ghosts, fading into the night like smoke. Danny stirred in his sleep, and Thomas moved to sit beside him. The boy's eyes opened, immediately alert despite having been unconscious moments before. "Are we safe?" Danny asked. "We're getting there," Thomas said softly. "How are you feeling?" Danny considered the question seriously. "Different, like maybe. I don't have to be scared all the time anymore." "You don't," Thomas assured him. "No one's ever going to chain you up again, I promise." "What happens now?" Thomas looked out the window at the dark landscape rolling by. "Now we start over. New names. New town, new everything. You get to be a regular kid. Go to school, make friends, do all the things kids are supposed to do. What about you? Are you coming too?" Thomas met Sarah's eyes across the aisle. She nodded slightly, encouraging him to make the leap. "If you want me to," Thomas said. "I want you to," Danny said without hesitation. "You're the first grown-up who kept a promise to me." The simple statement broke something open in Thomas's chest. For 3 years, he'd carried the weight of one boy's death, believing himself irredeemable. Now, another boy was offering him not just forgiveness, but trust, the most precious gift a damaged child could give. "Then I'm coming," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll figure it out together." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. "What about you, Marcus? What's your story in all this?" Marcus glanced at them in the rearview mirror. "Let's just say I know what it's like when the system fails the people it's supposed to protect. Sometimes you have to create your own justice." As the bus rolled through the night toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Thomas thought about the strange turns life could take. 3 days ago, he'd been a broken man counting down his days in isolation. Now he was part of a makeshift family, bound together by circumstance and choice, heading toward a second chance none of them had expected. The mountains of Colorado faded behind them, taking with them the ghosts of the past. Ahead lay the promise of Oregon's coast, where a boy who had learned to count scratches on chains could learn instead to count waves on the shore, and where a blacksmith who had lost his way could forge something new from the raw materials of redemption. 3 weeks later, in the small coastal town of Brookings, Oregon, a man named Michael Chen opened a small metalworking shop on the main street. His daughter Rebecca, a licensed social worker, enrolled 9-year-old David Chen in the local elementary school. The boy's teachers noted his exceptional artistic ability and his particular fascination with drawing birds in flight. None of the townspeople knew their real story, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that David laughed during recess, that Rebecca found meaningful work with the County Family Services Department, and that Michael discovered that the sound of hammer on anvil could be a song of hope rather than regret. Sheriff Davis in Colorado eventually closed the missing persons case, filing it under voluntary disappearance with a note about possible interstate flight. The Hendersons moved to another county, where they were quietly removed from the foster care system after a more thorough investigation revealed a pattern of abuse spanning several years. And in Cedar Falls, Thomas Brennan's empty cabin stood as a monument to isolation. While 300 miles away, Michael Chen built a new life founded on the simple truth that sometimes the greatest gift you can give another person is the chance to start over. On quiet evenings, when the shop was closed and Rebecca was helping David with his homework, Michael would stand on his front porch and listen to the sound of the ocean. It was different from the mountain silence he'd known before. Not empty, but full of possibility, like the steady breathing of the world itself. Danny, now David, had been right about promises. Some were worthless, spoken by people who had no intention of keeping them, but others were made of stronger stuff, forged in the fire of genuine care and tempered by the determination to protect what mattered most. The boy who had once counted scratches on chains now counted seashells on the beach, and the difference between those two numbers was nothing less than the distance between despair and hope, between a life sentence and a new beginning. In the end, it hadn't taken magic to transform their lives, just the simple alchemy of human kindness, applied at the moment when it mattered most. And if that wasn't a miracle worth believing in, Michael Chen didn't know what was. The forge in his new shop burned bright and clean, and the sound it made was no longer the echo of guilt, but the rhythm of redemption, hammering out a future that none of them could have imagined, but all of them deserved. As winter gave way to spring on the Oregon coast, Three people who had been strangers discovered they had become family, not through blood or law, but through the deeper bonds of shared struggle and mutual rescue. And in a world that often seemed designed to break the vulnerable, that was perhaps the most powerful transformation of all.